MS1, Block 3, Unit 10, Management of Organizational Conflict. 10.1 Introduction. Life is a never ending process of one conflict after another. Remember the time when you were a small child and had to choose between a tricycle and a cricket set, or say a set of dolls and a new frocks for a birthday present. That was probably your first exposure to conflict situation. Of course, this is a simplistic example of conflict, but has life been the same since? Probably not. This back and recall now each succeeding conflict in your life over the years has been increasingly complex. Conflict is a theme that has occupied the thinking of man or more than any other, with the expectation exception of God and love. Conflict has always been widespread in society, but it is only recently that it has generated a lot of interest and has been the focus of research and stirred. We are living in the age of conflict. Every day the choices available to us regarding any decision are increasing in number. You may have wanted to become a manager, an entrepreneur, or a computer scientist. On the other hand, your father might have wanted you to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a chartered accountant. Thus, you faced a conflict not only at an intrapersonal level in terms of the various choices confronting you, but also as an interpersonal level, you choices versus your further choice of a career for you. Conflict is not confined at the individual level alone, it is is manifesting itself more and more in organizations. Employees have become more vociferous in their demand for a better deal. Various departments in an organization face a situation full of conflict due to a number of reasons, like goal diversity, scarcity of resources, or task interdependence, etc. Management today is faced with the awesome responsibility of ensuring optimum level of growth and productivity in an environment that is full of conflict situation. A survey suggested that the modern manager spend over 20% of his time handling one form of conflict or the another. Top and middle level managers in the same survey have pointed out the importance of conflict management skill. We hope that the knowledge you will gain from this unit will equip you better to manage conflict situations more depthly at your workplace. 10.2 Type of conflict. Conflict within an individual. You can locate conflict at various levels. There could be conflict within oneself, the intrapersonal conflict. Basically, there are three types of such conflicts. You may have an excellent job offer in a city that you are willing to go to. In such case, you are attracted to and repelled by the same object and approach avoidance conflict. Similarly, you may be attracted to go equally appealing alternatives like seeing a movie or going for a picnic and approach conflict. You may also be repelled by two equally unpleasant alternatives like the threat of being dismissed if you fail to report against a friendly colleague who is guilty of breaking the organization's rule, and avoidance conflict. Conflict between individuals. Conflict can also take an interpersonal form. conflict between individuals take place owing to several factors, but most common are personal dislikes or personality differences. When there are only differences of opinion between individuals about task related matters, it can be construed as technical conflict rather than interpersonal conflict. Of course, technical and interpersonal conflict may influence each other due to role related pressure. The sales manager may put the blame for low sales volume on the production manager not meeting his production schedule and may start disliking the production manager as an incompetent person. It is often very difficult to establish whether a conflict between two parties is due to manifest rational factors or it emanates from hidden personal factors. Conflict between an individual and a group. This type of intra-group conflict arises frequently due to an individual's inability to conform to the group norms. For example, most groups have an idea of a fair day's work and may pressurize an individual if he exceeds or falls short of the group's productivity norms. Of if the individual resent any such pressure or punishment, he could come into conflict with other group members. Usually, it is very difficult for an individual to remain a group member and at the same time sustainability deviate from the group norms. So, in most cases, either he conforms to the group norms or quits or is rejected by the group. Of course, before taking any such extreme step, he or the other group members try to influence each other through several mechanisms leading to different episodes of conflict, much to the delight of the researchers in this field called group dynamics. Conflict between groups within an organization. Intergroup conflicts are one of the most important types of conflict to understand, as typically an organization is structured in the form of several interdependent task groups. Some of the usually chronic conflict in most of the organizations are found at this level. Example, union versus management. The union versus another union. The functional area like production versus the another functional area like maintenance. Direct recruits versus promotees, etc. The newly emerging field of organizational politics has started systematically investigating such types of conflict, and in a later section on the effect of conflict we shall give example of what happened to group when their conflicts are not solved. Conflict between organizations. Conflict between organizations is considered desirable if limited to the economic context only. The laissez faire economy is based on this concept. It is assumed that conflict between organizations lead to innovative and new products, technological advancement, and better services at lower prices. However, in this unit, we shall refrain from probing into this macro level conflict. 10.3 The process of conflict. You have just observed that beginning within an individual, conflict can be found on several levels. The nature of intrapersonal conflict is of very high significance, and the knowledge of mechanisms available to resolve it is immensely important in improving personal effectiveness. In this unit, however, our focus will be on interpersonal, intra-group and intergroup conflict, as these types directly influence effectiveness of an organization. For a conflict to exist, it must be perceived by the parties to it. If no one is aware of a conflict, then it is generally agreed that no conflict exists. Still, does a mere awareness of opposing goals or differences of opinion, options, or antagonistic feeling imply that there is a conflict? It would be easier for you to understand conflict if you view it as a dynamic process which includes antecedent conditions, cognitive states, affective states, and conflicting behavior. Have a look at the figure 1 on the conflict process, and you will be able to describe and analyze conflict between two parties, individuals, groups, or organizations in a chain of episodes which tend to unfold in a particular sequence. Potential antagonism. The first stage is the presence of antecedent conditions that create opportunities for conflict to arise. They need not necessarily lead to conflict and may be present in the absence of conflict as well. You may refer to this stage as the source of conflict, and in a later section, we shall have a fuller discussion on these antecedent conditions which might prepare the ground for the onset of the second stage. Some of these antecedent conditions which we shall discuss refer to scarcity of resources, heterogeneity of members, and diversity of goals, values, perceptions, degree of dependence between groups, insufficient exchange of information, etc. Cognition and personalization. The antecedent conditions may or may not lead to conflict. They must be perceived as threatening if conflict is to develop. The situation may be ignored if it is seen as minimally threatening. Moreover, if a conflict is perceived, it does not mean that it is personalized. Felt conflict. However, if feelings are generated, they tend to influence perception of a conflict. It is at the felt level when individual becomes emotionally involved and parties experience feeling of threat, hostility, fear, or mistrust. Conflictive and conflict management behavior. Manifest behavior is the action resulting from perceived and or felt conflict. At this stage, a conscious attempt is made by one party to block the goal achievement of the other party. Such behavior may range from subtle, indirect, and highly controlled form of interference to more open form of aggressive behavior like strikes, riots, and war. Most conflict handling behaviors are displayed in several forms like resignation and withdrawal, appeasement and compromise, confrontation and collaboration, etc. These behaviors are often referred to as conflict management styles and step from the strategies of conflict simulation or conflict resolution. In a later section, we shall discuss in greater details some of these models of conflict management. Aftermath. The interplay between different forms of over conflict behavior and conflict handling strategies of simulation or resolution influence the consequences. These consequences in terms of performance of the group, the level of satisfaction and quality of relationship in the involved parties, change of structure and policies, etc. In turns influence the antecedent conditions and probability of future conflict. Sometimes the aftermath shows the need of yet another conflict episode of which the case the entire process is repeated. The four stage conflict process model is a very useful framework to understand the episode of any conflict. On the basis of such a framework, you can now define conflict as the process which begins when A, as one party, perceives that B, as the other party, is making some conscious effort to frustrate A in pursuing the interest party A and or party B, may he an individual and or groups. 10.4 Different views about conflict. At this stage, you might be tempted to ask quite a few questions about the role of conflict in group and organizations. Can you avoid all conflict or are they inevitable? It is at all good to have any conflict. Who is primarily responsible in allowing a conflict to take place? What should be the role of manager once it arises? These are very important questions which people tend to answer in one way or the other depending upon the views they hold about conflict. The view about conflict itself are conflicting. In this section, we shall examine these views and their impact on management practices. The traditional view. The traditional view prevalent in the 1930s and 1940s regarded all conflict as harmful and evil. Conflict was viewed negatively and was associated with violence, turbulence, agitation, destruction, and irrationality. It was believed that conflict indicated a malfunctioning without the organization and that the appearance of conflict was the consequences of the management's failure to bind the employees and the organizations together and failure to communicate to them the commonality between the individual and organization's interest. Had the management corrected those lapses, according to the traditionalist, there would have been no conflict and the organization would have been able to function as a smooth integrated whole. In fact, Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, was of the opinion that if the principle of scientific management were properly applied, then the age old conflict between labor and management would disappear. The traditionalist view offer a rather simplified approach to conflict since all conflict is bad and it is to be avoided. Then we need merely isolate the factor that cause conflict and eliminate them. Research studies have provided evidence to dispute this viewpoint, yet many of us continues to believe that conflict is unnecessary and is to be always avoided. The behavioral view. The behavioral school of thought argues that conflict is the logical and inevitable outcome in an organization and as such should be accepted. The conflict there was dominated by the behavioralist approach from the late 1940s through the mid 1970s. The behavioralist maintained that since an organization was composed of individuals and they had different perception of goals and different values, conflict was bound to arise in the organization. Managers of various departments had separate priorities and conflicting ideas about resource allocation. Hence, conflict was the unavoidable outcome. Subordinates may clash with the manager over whether the work can be accomplished in the given period of time or not. They might even argue with subordinates at their own level over the best possible way to do a given job. Thus, according to the behavioralist, conflict was an unavoidable outcome, but at the same time, they believed that conflict need not always be determinantal. Under some circumstances, it could focus on problems and instigate a search for a better and more innovative solutions to problems. Through the behavioralist considered that conflict could lead to more creativity in problem solving and could be beneficial to organization under certain conditions, yet they perceived conflict as harmful, something to be resolved once it arose. Their view about human nature, where the people are essentially good, trust, cooperation, and goodness are given in human nature. According to the behavioralist, the major antecedent conditions which induce aggressiveness and conflict in people are the faulty policies and structure resulting in distortion and breakdown in communication. Hence, the manager role is resolving conflict is to restore understanding, trust, and openness between parties. The interactionist view. The thinking currently prevalent about conflict has been labeled as the interactionist view, in contrast to the behavioralist view, which merely accept conflict as inevitable. The interactionists not only accept conflict but also encourage it. However, they maintain that conflict must be regulated so that it does not get out of control, producing dysfunction consequences. The inevitability of conflict result from the intersection between organizationally imposed struggle for limited rewards, example status, responsibility, or power, and innate aggressive and competitive instinct in the people. Against this perspective, the intersectionist maintain that if harmony, peace, tranquility, and cooperativeness prevail in the situation for a long time, the group is prone to become non responsive to innovation and change. To shake the group out of its complacency and to make it viable, self critical, and creative, an ongoing minimum level of conflict must be maintained. Advocates of interactionist view emphasize that the mission of management is effective goal attainment, not the creation of harmony and cooperation. So, a manager task is not to eliminate or reduce conflict but to manage it in such a manner so that its beneficial effects are maximized and its negative or harmful aspects are minimized. Such conflict management may even include stimulation or conflict where absence of conflict may hamper an organization's innovation and creativity and thus prevent it from reaching an optimal level of performance. 10.5 The impact of conflict. From the discussion on different views on conflict was inference do you draw? Inference could be that conflict can have both positive and negative impact on individual, group, and organization. For example, as a result of intergroup conflict, certain changes occur within groups and between groups. Some changes have positive effect, others have negative effects. Let us explore this issue with Azure Chechin 1980, who was compiled a list of changes on the basis of research finding. As a result of intergroup conflict, some changes that may occur within the groups involved are: first is group cohesiveness increases. The group becomes more closely knit. Its members show greater loyalty. Second, the group becomes task oriented. Group climate changes from informal to task oriented in order to deal with a external threat. Third is leadership becomes more directive. As the group becomes more task oriented, the leader becomes more authoritarian. Fourth is organizational structure becomes more rigid. Authority and responsibility relationship among the and between members become more clearly defined. Fifth is group unity is stressed. The group demands increasing loyalty and conformity from its members. Prolonged group conflict causes the following changes in relationship between groups. First is groups become antagonistic towards each other. Each group sees the other as an enemy who interferes with its goal oriented behavior. Second, perceptions are distorted. Each group develops positive perceptions about its own group and negative perception towards the other. Third one is communication ceases to exist. When in conflict, member of one group avoid interaction with members of the other. If they are forced to interact, they tend to show hostility and aggressions towards each other. Fourth is groups apply a double standard. Each group clearly sees all the vicious act of the other parties while remaining blind to the same act performed by their own group. From the above two lists of changes within and between group in conflict, you can spot a number of negative effects. What about some potential benefits of intragroup conflict? Here is such a list. First is conflict clarifies the real issues. When people of group express their concerns and differences, it helps sharpen the real issue involved in a problem. Without conflict, many organizational problems go unnoticed and remain unresolved. Second is conflict increases innovation. Conflict generates a greater diversity of ideas and viewpoints. Such a diversity can simulate innovations in organizational practices. Third is intergroup conflict solidifies the group. When members of a group are faced with an externally enemy, they tend to work together more closely to deal with it. A manager may use this new cohesion to reduce internal conflicts. Fourth, conflict serves as a catharsis. catharsis. Conflict can provide an outlet through which organizational members can ventilate their feelings without damaging organizational functioning. Fifth is conflict resolution solidifies intergroup relationship. Once group conflict is successfully resolved, it can solidify the relationship between groups and it may even make the groups feel closer to each other. Looking into some of the effect of conflict, you can take a balanced view to conclude that conflict is inherently neither good nor bad but simply as the potential to improve or impair an organization's performance through its consequences. Conflict that result in increased organization's performance and help an organizations to attain its goal may be termed as functional. On the other hand, conflict that hinders an organization's growth and prevent it from achieving its goal can be termed as dysfunctional. Thus, conflict in certain forms can be functional or dysfunctional depending upon its nature, intensity, duration, and the manner in which it is handled. You may ask, how do I know whether a conflict is functional or dysfunctional? On what criteria should I base my judgment about the value of conflict? It is true that the demarcation between functional and dysfunctional conflict is neither clear nor precise. No particular level of conflict can be adopted as acceptable or by the impact it has on group unit performance rather than on a single individual. Criterion for you to base on your judgment upon its unit performance. Since a group exists to achieve certain predetermined goals, the functionality of a conflict can be measured by the impact it has to group unit performance rather than on a single individual. There is a figure next to it, and the figure summary is: there is an optional, highly functional level of conflict at which the unit's performance is at the maximum. This can happen because at the level of conflict, the group or the unit's internal environments is characterized by self-criticism and innovativeness. When the conflict level is too low, it is dysfunctional as the unit's performance is low due to apathy, stagnation, lack of new ideas, and non-progressiveness of the unit members to the demand of change. In such a situation, a manager may have to resort to stimulation conflicts to make the unit more viable. On the other hand, when the conflict level is too high, it is again dysfunctional as the survival of the group or the unit is threatened owing to diversion of energies away from performance and goal attained activities of the members. Chaos and disruption prevailed. Naturally, the most important managerial task becomes how to resolve the conflict. 10.6 Sources of conflict. In the earlier section, you have seen that it would be naive to think that conflict in an organization take place simply due to lack of understanding between people. A large number of potential sources of conflict exists in organizational life and as antecedent conditions and realistic basis of some conflicts. In this section, we shall quickly review some such resources. And the first point is competition for limited resources. Any group exists for the purpose of attaining some goals with the help of available resources. These resources may be tangible like material and money, or intangible like power, status, or the manager's time. No organization is capable to provide all the resources demanded by various units. Resources are limited and different resources have to compete for these scarce resources, and many conflict arises from this source. Diversity of goals. Groups in organizations have different functions to perform, and as such they develop their own norms and goals. Theoretically, the achievement of these goals should achieve overall organizational goal, but often in real life the reserve is true. Goals of one group are incompatible to the goals of another group. Take, for example, a company which manufactures electric fans that has a seasonal demand. Three departments three departments, marketing, production and finance, are involved. Since the demand for the product is seasonal, the marketing manager would like to have sufficient stock during the season. The production department has to gear up its capacity during the season, but because of a tight labor market find it difficult to hire labor temporarily and resorts to employ people on a permanent basis. This creates another problem. The finance manager says that as the storage costs are high, it is expensive to keep stock build up in a slack season. The maintaining the production line during slack season impose an additional burden. This example shows that each department develops its own goals which may conflict with another department's goal, and one department may try to achieve its goals at the expense of another. This happens quite often when the reward system is linked to group performance rather than to overall organizational performance. Task interdependence. Groups in an organization do not function independent of one another. They have to interact with one another in order to accomplish their task. The sales department will have nothing to sell unless the production people produce goods, and goods cannot be produced unless the financial department comes up with the money to buy raw materials. Thus, smooth interaction between various groups is essential for the efficient functioning of the organization. Three types of interdependence can cause intergroup conflict: pooled, sequential, and reciprocal. Pooled interdependence exists when two work groups may not directly interact with each other but are affected by each other's action. For example, when one independent product group performs poorly, all other groups may suffer financially. This can happen when rewards are contingent upon collective performance. Sequential interdependence occurs when one group's performance depends on another group's prior performance. In a construction project, for example, the excavating team must prepare the foundation before the masons can work on the building structure. Since the masons depend on the excavators, conflict between the groups can occur when the excavator's work is delayed. Reciprocal interdependence occurs when two or more groups are mutually interdependent in accomplishing their task. For example, in developing and marketing a new product, three major departments, marketing, production, and research, depend on each other to perform their task. Information processed by one department is needed by another department. For example, the research department needs market information from the marketing department, and marketing needs research to provide customer service. When one group is unable to meet the expectation of another group, intergroup conflict usually results. Differences in values and perception. A lot of conflict is generated within organizations because various groups within the organization hold conflicting values and perceiving situations in a narrow, individualistic manner. An example that comes readily to mind is that of the management labor conflict. Labor feels that management is exploiting it because, in spite of making a profit, management does nothing for the economic welfare of labor. On the other hand, management feels that the profit should go to cash reserve so as to make the company an attractive proportion to for investors. Another example is the conflict between engineering and manufacturing. Engineering lays stress on technological sophistication and precision and is caused by manufacturing of designing products that will last for 50 years but that the customer cannot afford. Similarly, engineering assures manufacturing of making products of such limited durability that the company's reputation suffers. Organizational ambiguities and as implied, conflict may emerge when two organizational units compete over new responsibility. Intergroup conflict stemming from disagreement about who has responsibility of ongoing tasks is an even more frequent problem. Now newcomers to organizations are often struck by the ambiguity that exists about job responsibilities. Few organizations make extensive use of job descriptions or periodically update the job descriptions that do exist. Further, it is rare that the manager or employee consult his own job description. Managerial and staff job by their very nature are difficult, so structure tightly around a job description. Introduction of change. Change can breed intergroup conflict. Acquisitions and mergers, for example, encourage intergroup conflict, competition, and stress. When an organization is merged into another, a power struggle often exists between the acquiring and acquired company. An attempt is usually made to minimize conflict by laying out plans for power sharing before the acquisition of merger is consumed. Frequently, the acquired company is given representation on the board of directors of the acquiring company. Nevertheless, power struggles are difficult to avoid. Nature of communication. One of the major fallacies abounding about conflict is that poor communication is the cause of all conflict. A typical statement is, if we could just communicate with each other, we could eliminate our differences. Such a conclusion is not surprising considering the little time most of us have at our disposal communicating with one another. At the same time, evidence does suggest that problems in the communication channel such as noise, distortion, omission, and overload do affect the process of collaboration and lead to misunderstanding. The potential for conflict increases when either too little or too much communication takes place. Apparently, an increase in communications is functional up to a point whereafter it is possible to over communicate with a resultant increase in potential for conflict. Too much information as well as too little information can lay the foundation for a conflict. Aggressive nature of people. Another factor that has a large potential for generating conflict within an organization is personality characteristics that account for individual idiosyncrasies and differences. Evidence suggests that certain personality types, of example, individuals who are highly authoritarian, arrogant, autocratic, and dogmatic lead to potential conflict. People have a natural need to find an outlet for their aggressive tendencies. Organizations are sometimes used as arenas for expressions of aggressions, blowing off steam leading to conflict. This discussion on the source of conflict is intended to emphasize that it is not possible to design an organization which will remain conflict free for all time to come. Conflict is inevitable in an organization as some of these resources will always remain in any organization. However, these sources are not to be confused with the cause of a conflict. A conflict in ultimate analysis is caused by perception and feeling people experience when an incompatibility exists between what they want and what someone else want. When perception of incompatibility and feeling of frustration generate actions, conflict is manifested. 10.7 Model of Conflict Management. We can now move on to examine the model through which conflict can be handled so as to result in optimal unit performance. You have already seen that when conflict level is too low, the unit performance is also likely to be low, and there is a scope for a perspective manager to simulate conflict in order to enhance the performance of the group. Similarly, when the level of conflict is too high, conflict need to be resolved as to restore high performance and optimal level of conflict. So in this section we shall examine both the strategies of conflict management simulation as well as resolution. Stimulating productive conflict. Most of us since childhood have been taught to avoid conflict and even disagreement. How many times have you heard the statement, "Don't argue, stop fighting," or "It's better to turn the other cheek"? However, this tendency to avoid conflict is not always productive, and there are times when there is a need to simulate conflict. In an interesting experiment, series of groups were formed to tackle the problem. Some groups contained a planted members of two challenges the majority opinion. Some groups did not have. Without fail, all groups that had a planted members comes up with a more perspective solution than the other groups. However, when the group were asked to drop a member, all groups that had a planted member choose to drop the dissenting members despite the clear evidence that the conflict was beneficial. Such resistance to conflict is what managers have to overcome in simulation productive conflict. Robbins, 1978, suggested the following as sign where conflict stimulation is needed. First is the organization is filled with yes man. Second is employees are afraid to admit ignorance. Third is compromise is stressed in decision making. Fourth is managers put too much emphasis on harmony and peace. Fifth is people are afraid to hurting the feelings of others. Sixth is popularity is given more importance than technical competence. Seventh is people show great resistance to change. Eighth is new ideas are not forthcoming. Ninth is there is an unusually low rate of employee turnover. The presence of one or more of these signs is usually an indication of the need for conflict simulation. Once the need has been identified, you may adopt one or more of the following techniques. First, manipulated communication channels. A. Deviate messages from traditional channels. B. Repress information. C. Transmit too much information. And D. Transmit ambitious or threatening information. Second is alter the organization's structure. Redefine jobs, alter tasks, reform units or activities. A is increase a unit size. B is increase specialization or standardization. C. Add, delete or transfer organizational members. D. Increase interdependence between units. Third is alter personal behavior factors. And subpart A is change personality characteristics of leader. B is create role conflict. And C is develop role incongruence. These are only a few of the suggestions possible depending upon your values and the organization's value system. Some of the suggestions may even sound unethical, as you may feel that the desirable end state does not always justify the questionable means, like transmitting threatening information. We leave it for you to decide, but if by simulating your value conflict we become successful in helping you understand the important options of conflict simulation, we shall consider that such conflict are functional. Resolving interparty conflict. How and when? You have seen that stimulating conflict is a required mode of conflict management when groups are characterized by apathy, complacency, non-responsiveness to needed change, lack of enthusiasm for generating alternatives, etc. Though these symptoms are very much present in the number of work units in Indian organizations, and hence calls for appropriate conflict simulations interventions. The more commonplace are heightened manifest conflicts. So, for most practical purposes, you should not only possess the knowledge of different strategies of conflict resolution, but should also know when to use which strategy. There is no dearth of literature in this area. Of different authors have given different taxonomies in reviewing possible conflict resolution strategies. Here we consider Feldman's 1985 Strategies of Intergroup Conflict Resolution. The primary dimension along which intergroup conflict resolution strategies vary is how openly you as a manager should address the conflict. The chief characteristics of conflict avoidance strategies is that they attempt to keep the conflict from coming into the open. The goal of conflict diffusion strategies is to keep the conflict in abeyance and to cool the emotions of the parties involved. Conflict containment strategies allow some conflict to surface but tightly controlled which issues are discussed and the manner in which they are discussed. Conflict confrontation strategies are designed to uncover all the issues of the conflict and try to find a mutually satisfactory solutions. Now, conflict avoidance strategies. Ignoring the conflict, this strategy is represented by the absence of action. You, as a manager, have often avoided dealing with dysfunctional aspects of conflict. Unfortunately, when you avoid searching for the cause of the conflict, the situation usually continues or becomes worse over time. Although ignoring the conflict generally is ineffective of for resolving important policy issues, there are some circumstances in which it is at least a reasonable way of dealing with problems. One such circumstances in which ignoring the conflict is a reasonable strategy is when the issues seems to be symptomatic of others. More basic conflicts. For example, two groups may experience conflict over the amount and quality of office space. Such conflict often reflect more important issue about relative power and status. Resolving the office space problem would not address the key issue and attention could be directed more fruitfully to the more basic concern. Imposing a solution. This strategy consists of forcing the conflicting parties to accept a solutions devised by a higher level manager. Imposing a solution does not allow much conflict to surface, nor does it leaves room for the participant to air their grievances. So it also generally is an ineffective conflict resolution strategy. Any peace that is does achieve is likely to be short lived because the underlying issue are not addressed. The conflict reappearance in other guises and in other situations. Forcing a solution can, however, be appropriate when quick, decisive action is needed. For instance, when there is conflict over invented decisions and delays can be very costly, forcing a solution may be the best strategy available to top management. Likewise, it may be necessary when unpopular decisions must be made and there is very little chances that the parties involved could ever reach agreement. Thomas, 1977, an example of this is when an organization must cut back on the funding of programs. It is unreasonable to expect that any department would agree to cut its staff and expenses for the greater good. Yet some hard, unpleasant decisions ultimately must be made. Conflict diffusion strategies. Smoothing. One way you can deal with conflict is to try to smooth it over. By playing down its extent or importance, you may try to persuade the group that they are not so far apart in their viewpoint as they think that are point, but the similarities in their positions try to pat group members whose feelings have been hurt. or play down the importance of the issue. By smoothing the conflict, you can hope to decrease its intensity and avoid escalation or open hostility. Like forcing a solutions, smoothing generally is effective because it does not address the key points of conflict. However, smoothing sometimes can serve as a stopgap measure each to people cool down and regain prospection. In the heat of the battle, people may make statements that they are likely to escalate the conflict, and smoothing often can bring the disagreement back to a manageable level. Smoothing also may be appropriate when the conflict concerns non-work issue. For instance, intergroup conflict frequently occurs between older and younger employees because of their different political beliefs and moral values. Smoothing can help to diffuse the tension so that the conflict does not spill over into central work issues. Appealing to subordinate goals. You can diffuse conflict by focusing attention on the higher goals that the groups share or the long range aims that they have in common. Intend to make the current problem seem insignificant beside the more important mutual goals. Finding subordinate goals that are important to both groups is not easy. Achieving these goals require cooperation between the groups, so the rewards for achieving the goals must be significant. The most successful and the most frequently used subordinate goal is organizational survival. That is, if the subunits do not cooperate sufficiently, the continued existence of the larger organization itself will be severely jeopardized. Conflict containment strategies. Using representative. One of the strategies you can use to contain conflict is the use of representatives. In order to decide an issue, you can meet with representatives of the opposing groups rather than deal with the groups in their entries. The rationale is that the representatives know the problems and can argue the group point of view accurately and forcefully. Although this seems to be a logically way of proceeding, the research on the use of representatives as a mean of solving intergroup conflict is fairly negative. Representatives are not entirely free to engage in compromise, rather, they must act out of loyalty and are motivated to win or at least avoid defeat, even though solutions to be intergroup problems may be sacrificed in the process. A representative who gives in is likely to face suspicious or rejections from group members. So if a representative cannot win, he or she will try to deadlock a solutions or at least forestall defeat. Although individual representatives have difficulty in negotiating an agreement because of their fear of rejection by their groups, two, situation, two situational factors can increase the effectiveness of these strategies. First, the use of group representatives from each side can help to overcome individual anxiety about group rejection. The members of each team can provide mutual support when they need to make concessions in order to achieve agreement. Also, group of negotiators may receive broader support and trust from their respective sides, since each representatives may represent a different constituency or bring a different expertise to the negotiations. Most labor negotiations involve several representatives of both management and labor. Resolving conflict through representatives is more effective before positions become fixed or are made public. After positions become fixed, representatives become even more intransigent, and given in is more likely to be attributed to a personal failure of the representatives than to situational factors. Structuring the interaction. Some managers assume that one way to decrease conflict is to increase the amount of contact between the groups. If the groups interacted more, they would like each other better and fight less. In reality, increased interactions can merely add fuel to the fire. The two groups spend their times looking for additional reasons to reinforce their negative stereotypes of each other. However, structuring the interactions between the groups can be effective in resolving conflict, providing a framework on how many issues are discussed and the manner in which they are discussed can facilitate conflict resolution. There are many ways to structure the interactions between groups to deal with conflict. Some of most effective strategies includes: A. Decreasing the amount of direct interaction between the groups in the early stage of conflict resolution. B. Decreasing the amount of time between problem solving meetings. C. Decreasing the formality of the presentation of issues. D. Limiting the recitation of historic events and precedents and focusing instead on current issues and goals. And E is using third party mediators. All these strategies allow some conflict to surface but prevent it from getting out of hand and reduce hardening of the group's positions. Decreasing the amount of direct interactions between the groups early in the conflict helps to prevent the conflict from escalating. Decreasing the amount of time between problem solving meetings helps to prevent backsliding from tentative agreement. Decreasing the formality of the presentation of issues helps to induce a problem solving rather than a win loss orientation to the conflict. Limitation Limiting how far back historically and how widely precedents can be cited helps to keep the focus on finding a solutions to the current conflict. Finally, a mediator can act as a go-between who transmits offer and messages, helps the group to clarify their positions, presents each group's positions more clearly to the others, and suggests some possible solutions that are not obvious to the opposing parties. Structuring the interactions is especially useful in two situations. A. When previous attempts is discussed conflict issues openly led to conflict escalation rather than to problem solution, and B. When a respected third party is available to provide and enforce some structure in the interactions between the groups. Bargaining. Bargaining is the process of exchanging concession until a compromise solution is reached. Bargaining can lead to the resolution of a conflict, but usually without much openness of the part of the group involved and without much real problem solving. Typically, in bargaining, each side begins the demanding more than it really expects to get. Both sides realize that concessions will be necessary in order to reach a solution, but neither side wants to make the first concession because it may be perceived as a sign of weakness. Thus, each party signals a willingness to be flexible in exchanging concession without acting making and explicit offer or tactic proposal can be denied later if it fails to elicit a positive response from the other party. Bargaining continues until a mutually satisfactory agreement is reached. Although such a solutions can be reached without much open discussion of conflict issues and without much effort to solve the underlying problems. Therefore, bargaining often results in a compromise agreement that fails to deal with the problems in a rational manner and is not in the long term interests of either group. For bargaining to be feasible or at all as a conflict resolution strategy, for both parties must he of relatively equally power. Otherwise, one group simply will impose its will on the others, and the weaker group will have no means of obtaining concession from the stronger one. Bargaining also is more likely to work if there are several acceptable alternatives that both groups are willing to consider. Otherwise, bargaining is likely to end in a deadlock. Conflict confrontation strategies. Problem solving. Problem solving is an attempt to find a solution that reconciles or integrates the needs of both parties who work together to define the problems and to identify mutually satisfactory solutions. In problem solving, there is often expression of feeling as well as exchange of task related information. Alderfer 1977 summarizes the most critical ingredients in successful problem solving. First is definition of the problem should be joint effort based on shared fact finding rather than on the biased perception of the individual group. Second, problem should be shared in terms of specifics rather than as abstract principle. Third is points of initial agreement in the goal and beliefs of both groups should be identified along with the differences. Fourth is discussion between the groups should consist of specific non-evaluative comments. Questions should be asked to elicit information, belittle not to belittle the opposition. Fifth, the groups should work together in developing alternatives solutions. If this is not feasible, each group should present a range of acceptable solutions rather than promoting the solutions that is best for it while concealing other possibilities. 6. Solutions should be evaluated objectively in terms of quality and acceptability to the two group. When a solution maximizes joint benefits but favors one's party, some way should be found to avoid special benefits to the other party to make the solutions equitable. 7 is all agreements about separate issues should be considered tentative until every issue is dealt with, because issues that are interrelated cannot be settled independently in an optimal manner. There are two preconditions for successful integrative problem solving. The first is a minimal level of trust between the groups. Without trust, each group will fear manipulation and may not reveal its true preferences. Secondly, integrative problem solving takes a lot of time and can succeed only in the absence of pressure for a quick settlement. However, when the organization can benefit from merging the differing perspective and insights of the two groups in making key decisions, integrative problem solving is especially needed. Organizational redesign. Redesigning or restructuring the organization can be an effective intergroup conflict resolution strategy. This is especially true when the source of conflict result from the coordination of work among their departments or division. Unlike the other strategies discussed so far, you may note organizational redesign can be used both to resolve the conflict or to stimulate it. One way of redesigning organization is to reduce task interdependence between groups and to assign each group clear work responsibility, that is, create self-contained work group to reduce conflict. This is most appropriate when the work can be divided easily into distinct projects. Each group is provided with clear project responsibilities and the resources needed to reach its goal. The potential cost of this strategy is duplication and waste of resources, particularly when one group cannot fully utilize equipment or personnel. Innovation and growth also may be restricted to existing project areas, with no group having the incentive or responsibility to create new ideas. The other way to deal with conflict through organizational redesign is to develop overlapping or joint work responsibilities. Example, integrator roles. This helps in management of maximizing the use of different perspective and abilities of the different departments, but as you have already seen, it also tends to create conflict. On the other hand, there may be tasks, example, developing new products, that do not fall clearly into any one department's responsibilities but requires the contribution, expertise and coordination of several. Assigning new product development to one department could decrease potential conflict but at a high cost to the equity of the product. In this case, you might try to sustain task-based conflict but develop better mechanism for managing the conflict. For example, providing integrating teams can facilitate communications and coordinations between the members of interdependent departments. 10.8 Summary. In this unit, we have considered mainly various types of intergroup conflicts, as these types are most pervasive and important from the point of view of organization effectiveness. In keeping with our emphasis on intergroup conflict, we have defined conflict as a process which begins when A as one party perceive that B as other party is making some conscious effort to frustrate A in pursuing his interest or goals. Besides intergroup conflicts, there are other types of conflicts as well: intra-individual, interpersonal, intergroup, and between organization. In general, conflict process has four stages of potential: antagonism, cognition, and personalization, conflictive and conflict of coping behavior, and conflict aftermath. We have examined three different views on conflict: traditional, behavioral, and interactionist. The current view of conflict is that it is not only inevitable but could be desirable as well, depending upon nature, intensity, duration, and the way it is handled. It could be functional, leading to higher goals attainment, or dysfunctional, leading to goal failure. The section on the source of conflict has focused attention on the number of factors like competitions for limited resources, diversity of goals of different units, task interdependence of different units, differences in values and perception, etc., which are always present in an organization as antecedent conditions for most of the conflict. There are different modes of managing conflict in an organization. When a work group shows the symptoms of overemphasizing conformity, compromising conscious popularity, etc., there may be need of simulating conflict by manipulating communication channels, organizational structure, and personal behavior of the manager. These techniques are to be used to shake the group up from its slack ends postures. There are four distinct strategies of conflict resolutions because as a manager you need to know when and how to resolve conflict, while avoidance and diffusion strategies allows little or no conflict into the open. Containment and confrontation strategies deal with the conflict more openly and thoroughly. Which strategies is most effective depends on how critical the conflict is to task accomplishment and how quickly the conflict must be resolved. If the conflict arises from a trivial issue and or must be resolved quickly, a conflict avoidance or conflict diffusion strategy is most likely to be effective if the conflict centers around an important work issue and does not need to be solved in a short period of time. A conflict containment or conflict